What's going on, guys? It's Danny from Fantasy Stock Exchange here, and today I'll be going through my top 5 breakout candidates of the 2022 fantasy football season, going over guys that are going in the mid-rounds of your fantasy football drafts that have a chance at being this year's league winner. And for my purpose to be classified as a mid-round player, I mainly coop the guys going between rounds 3 and 9 that have the opportunity to downright break fantasy football. Reaching the tail end of Superlatives week, I got you covered for the next 2 days, with today being my top 5 breakouts, tomorrow being my top 5 busts, and Corey will wrap up Superlatives week with his top 5 sleepers on Monday. But either way, before we get into my top 5 breakouts, if you enjoy content like this and are interested in watching more, make sure you leave a like down below and subscribe to the channel. Currently at about 14,000 subscribers. We want to hit 14 and potentially 15,000 going into this season. So if you guys smash that like button and subscribe down below, help us on that journey to 15,000 subscribers. But that being said, let's hit the intro. All right, so as Cooper Kupp, Jamar Chase, Mark Andrews, Deebo Samuel, guys like that last year showed, some of the most advantageous players to roster on your fantasy teams have come from not just the top end of your drafts, but also in the mid-rounds. You guys can see on the screen right now, but out of the top 15 best ball win rate players in 2021, 5 of them actually emerged from this, pick 35 to pick 100 type of range. Obviously, the main guys being guys like Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, Mark Andrews, Jamar Chase, and Justin Herbert in particular. And having these guys on your team in conjunction with, early round booms such as guys like Austin Eckler and Jonathan Taylor basically locked up your championship straight out of the draft. You didn't have to grind the waiver wire. You didn't have to grind trades. You already had a roster that was putting up elite point potential just based off the backs of absolutely smashing your draft. So taking the information we got from last year and profiling these next 5 guys I'll talk about into the mold of a breakout from last year, here are my top 5 entering 2022. And number 5 on my list is going to be Rhamondre Stevenson, running back from the New England Patriots, currently going off the board as the RB36, 99th overall on multi-site ADP via 4for4. And to me, he represents the Leonard Fournette case from last year. He's currently my RB26, 87th overall player. So a severe jump for me for, a guy that hates running backs to have this guy ahead of ADP, both in terms of overall ADP and at the running back position. And it's pretty simple. We have a second-year running back with Rhamondre Stevenson that last year saw only 31 combined opportunities in the first 8 weeks of the year compared to 120 opportunities in his final 8 games, which mathed out equaled about 15 opportunities per game. We saw in those last 8 games, Rhamondre develop into a player that was able to put up 120 opportunities into 585 yards from scrimmage in that stretch and 4 touchdowns, which per game equals about 73 yards per game and about a half touchdown per game. So with Rhamondre Stevenson, we saw clearly last year when given the opportunity, he looked like the Patriots' all-around best back on the team. And the basis of this breakout is that the Patriots feel the same way that I do, and they end up giving the number 1 duties to Rhamondre Stevenson, which a case, as I kind of said, is very similar to what we saw last year with the 2021 Buccaneers between Ronald Jones and Leonard Fournette. In a situation of ambiguity, you guys have heard me stress all offseason. If there's an ambiguous backfield situation, you want to prioritize and favor the side that will give you access to more upside, which is the case last year. In 2021, we saw with the Bucs backfield debate featured one running back with Ronald Jones, who we knew wasn't going to command elite receiving volume, who we knew wasn't going to get complete goal line autonomy given issues in the past with Jones. And we saw conversely in the 2020 playoffs, Leonard Fournette was trusted with that 3-down role. Leonard Fournette was trusted with receiving opportunity, with goal line opportunity in that backfield. So while we thought going into the year that Ronald Jones was going to be the main back, there was always the possibility that if Leonard Fournette did take over, he would become a 3-down workhorse back with legitimate top 5 to 10 running back upside in fantasy football, which is exactly what I see with Rhamondre Stevenson in 2022. I think Damon Harris is a fine between the tackles runner that can be a consistent focal point in between the tackles, like I said. But Rhamondre brings an element of being able to work in space, being able to break tackles like on a 190-pound back, despite showing as a 230-pound bruiser in terms of his nature. He's actually a very nimble player that can work on pass downs like we saw this past year. The pros to Rhamondre, in my opinion, are that in an ambiguous situation, he has the ability to be a full-fledged 3-down workhorse that I simply don't think is the case with a guy like Damien Harris. The reason why having a 3-down skill set this year in particular for the Patriots is so crucial, within this offseason, we have seen longtime Patriots third down back James White retired due to a hip injury, and the Patriots losing Ty Montgomery this preseason to an ankle injury, opening a huge opportunity, a huge door for Rhamondre to potentially occupy that Patriots satellite role, given the skill set he has in comparison to Damien Harris. And you guys can see a graphic on the screen, but basically a reporter from The Athletic believes that with Ty Montgomery's ankle injury, we could see a ton of more work on third down for a guy like Rhamondre Stevenson. And at worst case with Rhamondre, you're getting an elite handcuff running back in the case that Harris missed time. So if he was just solely a handcuff, I would still rank him amongst the likes of guys like Alexander Mattison, Melvin Gordon in that area of drafts. But the breakout potential here is the Stevenson upside case. And you guys can see another graphic on the screen from Bill Belichick himself, reported by Mike Rice. But basically, he says that he acknowledges that Harris and Rhamondre are looking at all 3 downs. Or, aka, if one of these backs can emerge in the pass game, they have no problem with getting rid of that designated pass back that we have seen from the Patriots in a while and giving one of them the full workload. And Rhamondre is much more adept in the passing game than Damien Harris is, so it's much more likely, in my opinion, that Rhamondre emerges to the top, that Rhamondre rises to the top, than it would be with Damien Harris to do the same thing. So I think Rhamondre's got the upper leg here in terms of pass game situation. And we also have another report on NBC Sports Edge that Zach Cox also does believe that it wouldn't be a shock if Rhamondre, given his performance last year, given how he's looked in training camp, ends up usurping or leapfrogging Damien Harris for that main early down work for the Patriots. So to sum it up, after seeing last season what Stevenson can do with a heightened workload down the stretch, I wouldn't find it surprising at all if the Patriots just said, hey, this is our best running back. We'll give him a 3-down workload. And if we're getting a 3-down workload from what I think is an ascending offense and ascending talent with Rhamondre Stevenson, we could be looking at a potential top 15 back opportunity for Stevenson in fantasy football. So skipping the dead zone and passing on guys like David Montgomery, for example, who are propped up on their workload, I would much rather take the upside shot that if Rhamondre does develop, he is this year's Leonard Fournette, and you bypassed a ton of ugly projection in the mid rounds and ended up getting a guy like Rhamondre round 9 to be your RB2. I think he's got the upside this year to potentially pay off in a huge way. So Rhamondre Stevenson, first running back on the list. We can now transition to my 4th overall breakout of the 2022 fantasy football season. That's going to be quarterback Trey Lance of the San Francisco 49ers, going off the board as the quarterback 12, 88th overall in aggregate. And he's actually my quarterback 7, 73rd overall player. So a clear gap between where I have him ranked and where the consensus really has him ranked right now in fantasy football. And you guys have heard me make this case a ton on the channel. He is this year's Jalen Hurts. It is very simple to me. Think what Jalen Hurts represented last year, but now we get a quarterback that's tied to Kyle Shanahan with more talented pass weapons in his group and a higher passing ceiling, in my opinion, with what Trey Lance represents this year versus what Jalen Hurts represented last year. Everything you want in a fantasy football quarterback, Lance has in spades. And this nugget from Dwayne McFarland basically preaches exactly why it matters to have a quarterback that can rush the football in fantasy football. We've seen the last 2 years that Taysom Hill has averaged only 206 passing yards per game and less than a passing touchdown per game in games that he spent with at least 15 dropbacks, and yet was still a 21 point per game scorer in that stretch, which would have ranked as a top 9 points per game finisher in each of the last 15 years. Trey freaking Lance tweet he kind of outlines here, and it's simple to me. We saw that upside. We saw that rushing capability of Trey Lance in spades last year. 3 games that Lance played over 50% of the snaps this past year. He averaged about 19 points per game, and he had 31 carries and 161 rushing yards in that stretch. Yes, I will fully admit he has got a ways to go as a passer for sure, but the rushing floor he provides you is the only basis we really need to see going into the season. And of course, the upside being here, if a 22-year-old 3rd overall pick picks up the game from a passing perspective, we could be looking at the next Josh Allen in terms of fantasy circles. If he develops as a passer, given his arm talent, given his mobility, this could be this year's Josh Allen. And I don't say that lightly. He had a pace last year of 176 carries and 912 rushing yards across 17 games, which, as we know, would have been an elite number from a rushing perspective for fantasy football quarterbacks. And Ian Hartitz of PFF actually outlines this quite easily, but 11 of the last 12 signal callers who've received at least 125 carries in a season went on to post as a top 12 quarterback in terms of production on a per game basis, including 7 of those 12 being as a top 5 overall quarterback in fantasy football. The main case against Trey Lance that I have seen are that, there are safer quarterbacks in this range, when in reality, in my opinion, I could care less how good a quarterback is in real life when it comes to fantasy land. As much as I believe, guys like Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott, Tom Brady, Matt Stafford are much better real life quarterbacks than Trey Lance, Trey Lance, to me, is such a safer quarterback from fantasy football perspective due to that rushing upside, only paralleled by guys like Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, and Jalen Hurts in terms of fantasy football. And for Trey Lance, he's a quarterback 7 in my personal ranks, but I think it's much more realistic that he develops into a potential top 3 quarterback, develops his passing game. Obviously, those weapons go lower there. Maybe he's a 25 plus passing touchdown player on the back of maybe 4,000 passing yards. If he's able to develop into that type of passer, given this rushing advantage he has, I think it's a near lock he's a top 3 to 5 quarterback. And if that doesn't happen, I think his floor is top 12 quarterback, given that rushing upside, given the history that rushing quarterbacks have in terms of dominance in fantasy football, especially in 4-point passing touchdown leagues. It makes it almost insane to me if somebody isn't on the Lance train, because the blueprint is clear cut. And again, if he makes those strides as a passer, he not only beats his quarterback 12 ADP, he downright obliterates it. So getting Trey Lance now at the 88th overall pick, an 8th round quarterback with this level of tantalizing upside to be, like I said, maybe this year's Jalen Hurts, maybe this year's Josh Allen, I'm absolutely smashing Trey Lance on every single one of my teams where I miss out on those elite dual threat quarterbacks at the top of my drafts. The number 3 breakout I have listed here is going to be wide receiver from the Denver Broncos, Jerry Jeudy. Currently going off the board, it's the wide receiver 24, 60th overall pick on multi-site ADP. And I have him listed here as the Deebo Samuel case. He is personally my wide receiver 18, 36th overall player. So for those of you at home, yes, I have him 24 spots ahead of where he currently goes in some of your leagues. So whether you're drafting on ESPN, Yahoo, Sleeper, obviously we would have made videos this past week detailing the biggest values there. But I think Jerry Jeudy across all platforms is a huge value in fantasy football. And the reason why he's my number 3 breakout is pretty simple to me. He's entering his 3rd year with a huge improvement at the quarterback position with Russell Wilson coming to town. And all the hype we've seen this offseason has pointed to the fact that, well, what can Russ do to unlock Courtland Sutton? I'd much rather place the bet on the 23-year-old 3rd-year breakout candidate in Jeudy, in my opinion, who is a much more calculated dart throw if you're going to be taking an upside shot in this range, which you historically should. We saw last year in the 10 games that Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton shared the field together, Jerry Jeudy completely dominated from an output standpoint. 38 receptions, 467 yards, and 58 targets in those 10 games they shared together. When in comparison for Courtland Sutton, only put up 18 receptions, 190 yards, and 38 targets in that stretch. And yet the market is just valuing Sutton based off his archetype, based off the role he should play as the X receiver in this offense because of historical trends with Russell Wilson, when in reality, we should be measuring how this Denver Broncos offense looks on face value. And to me, it's pretty simple. Again, I understand Sutton, familiar X-style archetype. People want to profile him as the next DK Metcalf because Russell Wilson is throwing him the football. But I just can't ignore how dominant, like I said, Jeudy was over Sutton from a target share perspective this past year. In the games they shared the field together, Jeudy posted a near 20% target share to Sutton's 13.5%. And a 24.1 target rate, which basically means in routes that he ran, how often he was targets, aka targets per route run for Jerry Jeudy. He was the dominant wide receiver amongst the two when they shared the field together. And as I kind of alluded to, past data would indicate that the 23-year-old third-year breakout candidate rather than a 27-year-old Sutton who declined from an efficiency perspective. And you guys can see on the screen, but year 3 is actually the second highest breakout rate amongst wide receivers, trailing only year 2, which we'll get into on my next case. But basically for me, I look at it from a contextual standpoint. Jeudy's year 3 can basically be considered his year 2, given the amount of time he missed last year and given the amount of games he played that he was not at full health capacity. So why Sutton gets a huge excuse last year for bad quarterback play, for playing through injury, I don't understand why Jeudy doesn't get that same excuse when we saw when he was fully healthy. Jeudy commanded 7 targets and posted a 6 for 72 stat line in week 1 on the 47% of snaps that he played prior to that high ankle sprain. He looked like he would be a league winner last year. He looked like he would be the next breakout candidate last year. And yet, due to a season loss of injury, we can actually compare him to what it looked like from Deebo Samuel in 2020 compared to 2021. Because in 2020, we saw a player that, despite battling through injury, despite missing time, still commanded targets when he was on the field. He just couldn't put it all together. And then finally in 2021, once he returned to health, despite the receiving pecking order coming to the year, consisting of guys like George Kittle and Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel was able to emerge and Deebo Samuel was able to break out. And for Jerry Jeudy's perspective, I think similar to Deebo Samuel, we weren't wrong about the Jeudy breakout. We were just a year too early. And in my opinion, you need to be buying the dip on a third-year Bama product that I expect to have a potential wide receiver 1 caliber year this year with him catching passes from a Hall of Fame level quarterback. Don't skip out on Jerry Jeudy because of a preconceived narrative that Russ is going to throw it to the big body. Target the better player in what should be a high octane Broncos offense. I want all of the Jerry Jeudy in the 4th round, in the 5th round, wherever you have to take him in your drafts. I'm fine and comfortable with taking him. Again, a top 36 overall player on my board. The number 2 breakout I have going into the 2022 season, and if you guys have been a fan of the channel for a while, you know exactly who is coming. The guy wearing that jet green himself, Elijah Moore of the New York Jets, currently going off the board as the wide receiver 35, 81st overall player on multi-site ADP. He is currently, yes, my wide receiver 24, 52nd overall player. 29 picks ahead of where he goes on ADP, 11 overall rankings of where I have him at wide receiver compared to the ADP. And it's pretty simple to me. This is clearly the T. Higgins case from last year. And we saw Elijah Moore's rookie season this past year as an interesting development, to say the least. And let me just give you the synopsis, give me the breakdown as to exactly what happened with Elijah Moore in his rookie season. He entered last year with a quad strain, suffered a week 3 concussion that limited his play, especially in the early portion of the season. And ultimately, after week 13, landed on IR with another quad injury. But despite dealing with these injuries, he still suited up in those 4 games to start the year. And it clearly ailed him between fighting inefficient quarterback play and these injuries. Moore got off to an extremely inefficient start in those games, turning 20 targets into only 66 receiving yards with no touchdowns, as well as only 3.65 PPR points per game in that stretch. Clearly not an indicator over Elijah Moore's talent, in my opinion, because once we finally saw him healthy and ready to roll from a fantasy football perspective, he absolutely dominated. Post-bye week between weeks 7 and 13, Elijah Moore was not only good, he was flat out dominant. He was a player that in that stretch, week 7 to 13, commanded 57 targets or 8.1 targets per game, en route to post 472 receiving yards or 67 receiving yards per game, as well as 6 touchdowns in the stretch, which would have equated to 17.7 PPR points per game and a top 10 wide receiver finish on the season, despite, like I said, inadequate quarterback play in this timeline. I think, in my opinion, Moore is clearly a budding star level talent. And entering a full healthy offseason, going into his second year, a year that historically smashes for young wide receiver talent. You guys can see the graphic on the screen, by the way. Wide receiver breakout rates between 2010 and 2021 for players selected in rounds 3 to 8. We saw good sophomore players completely obliterate other receivers in this stretch in terms of absolutely smashing their ADP. Outperform their positional ADP by more than 6 spots points per game. We saw that happen 41.9% of the time for good sophomore receivers. And we saw them outperform their positional ADP by 12 or more spots at a 25.8% rate. And not to mention the graph I showed earlier where year 2 is typically the highest breakout rate by NFL experience, according to Sean Siegel. But with Elijah Moore, this is a player last year who was wide receiver 33 overall seasonal in terms of points per game, and now is going off the board as the wide receiver 34 in draft. So we talked about the peak period, but even from an overall points per game standpoint, he is currently going behind where he was performing last year. Not to mention this tweet from Ryan Heath basically sums it up pretty well. But the reason why we push these second-year breakout candidates so far down the board is a lot of people are so focused on, yes, what they did from year one, how we can project from year one going into year two, that they ultimately don't bake in natural improvement from a player and situational improvement from year one to two. With Elijah Moore, he just seems like one of the biggest inefficiencies in the market currently. And for me personally, if I'm going to pick anybody this year to break out in year two in a big way, it's going to be Elijah Moore. If you needed any more proof that he is a 22-year-old budding star, despite that stretch I told you between week 7 and 13 where he was a top 10 receiver, he got the nod of approval from Matt Harmon himself. Matt Harmon basically went out on reception perception, talked about him as one of the best up-and-coming separators in the entire NFL. And despite battling those injuries in the early portion of the season, graded as an 81st percentile separator against man, 76th percentile separator against zone, and a 70th percentile separator against press. So with Elijah Moore, you're getting an elite separator entering a historical year for breakouts at his position, and he's going outside of the top 30 overall wide receivers, despite every single report this offseason indicating the fact that he is the Jets' clear wide receiver run, a role that, like I said, down the stretch last year, he smashed. My number one breakout candidate of the 2022 season is going to be running back Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars, currently going off the board as the RB17 41st overall player. And he is currently ranked as my RB14 29th overall player. To me, this is the clear-cut DeAndre Swift case of this year. And Etienne case is pretty simple, as I kind of said, but people are so focused on trying to beat ADP at the running back position. I want a player that can downright dominate the ADP. With Travis Etienne, he is the type of running back where, yes, he's got a lower flow inherently compared to the projected workloads of guys like James Conner and Ezekiel Elliott. But with Travis Etienne, similar to what we said with DeAndre Swift last year, he doesn't need a 70, 80% opportunity share to be able to be a stud fantasy football running back. Even on 60, 65, 70% of the opportunities, which I expect Travis Etienne to contend for, he can still be an 80, 90, 100 plus target back given the third down usage we have seen. And with Travis Etienne, if you guys have any question marks over the talent level that we have here, are we just taking this guy because of resume, or are we taking this guy because he's an elite talent? Well, he's got the two things I always want and covet when spotting a breakout caliber type of running back. He's got breakaway ability, which we saw in abundance in college. This is a player that led the NCAA in broken tackles between 2019 and 20, not to mention commanded a 90-plus grade from Next Gen Stats, which we've seen 100% of the running backs who earn a 90-plus grade have finished as a top 12 running back at some point in terms of fantasy football. I think this is the year for Travis Etienne to join that group and be a DeAndre Swift level player. For Travis Etienne, he's entering a situation in Jacksonville where there is no clear-cut pecking order in terms of targets, nor one alpha that can absolutely command 140, 150, 160 plus targets in this offense, in a team that I expect to throw the ball at an above-average rate like they did last year. A big thing that I'm really excited by when it comes to Travis Etienne is the schematic change happening under Doug Peterson with the Jaguars. We saw it all preseason, but this is a team that wants to get Trevor Lawrence on the run. This is a team that wants to work in space, wants to utilize their speed. And this is highlighted by an actual quote from Trevor Lawrence, but basically he's noticed right off the bat that Peterson wants to prioritize speed and playing fast and instinctively. The Jags are a very young offense. They don't want to overthink. They want to go out there, they want to play ball, and they want to play fast. And that has been everything stressed under Doug Peterson this offseason, and a mold that fits Travis Etienne's playing style to a T. If we're getting access to that receiving role, combined with more early down work and possibly goal line work if James Robinson isn't ready to start the year, I think Etienne has an opportunity to not only be a player that beats his ADP, but can be a 20-plus PPR point per game scoring back and be a first-round caliber fantasy football pick this time next year. I'm all over Travis Etienne. You guys should be too. But either way, if you made it this far in the video, hope you guys enjoyed. Time is running out to get your shot at $10 million in total prizes in BBM3. Imagine winning that $2 million in that contest for coming in first, $1 million to second, and $1 million to the highest scorer in the regular season. Take your fantasy football knowledge into action by using code FSC at sign up and first deposit for 100% match back up to $100. Basically, if you guys put $100 in, that is $200 on the site or 8 bullets in the chamber to win $2 million as a thank you for using code FSC. You'll also get our redraft and dynasty rankings manifesto for free, including our draft ready cheat sheet that you can bring directly to your draft. So check it out if it interests you. Appreciate you guys for supporting the channel. Also check out the Patreon if you want to further support the show. Peace out, guys. Enjoy your weekend.